Hello and welcome to this section on intermediate JavaScript. Let's look at the section objective. After completing this section, you will be able to learn how to write functions like write function, call function, pass parameter to the function. Then you learn how to deal with objects, how to create events like on click, on mouse over, and how to deal with them. Then how to write trace logs in the web page. Then I'll show you some of the common errors that you will face with JavaScript. They will write a try catch block, try to raise an error from a try block and then try to catch that in the catch block. They will look some of the examples of working with the DOM, that is document object model. We will work around accessing all the elements of the HTML page. They will also access some of the form elements. Could be a good case for validating our form. When the user submits a form, you capture the control, you try to read all the field values and then try to check whether the field values are correct or not. That's a part of the form validation. So we go a little deeper in some of the real-time use cases of using JavaScript, and then we'll have fun with this section. Alright, so those are the lectures in this section. So let's start this section now. Hello and welcome to the lecture on functions. So let's create another folder. Intermediate JavaScript. Let's create functions here. Create a file called functions.html. Okay, so we'll understand how to write functions, and then we'll change our folder as well. Move back to intermediate JavaScript. Alright, and we will use this boilerplate as well. Okay, so let's write a simple function. So how do you write a function? That's what we'll understand in this lecture. Okay, function, you have to define a keyword called function, and then you have to give a name of a function. Let's say you are saying sum, and you can differentiate different parameters with a comma, open and close flower brackets. Then you can use a return statement to return the value. So you can say a plus b, okay, to return the value. And how do you call that function, right? How do you call that function? Let's call this function. So on click of this event, you're calling an alert, and in this alert I'm passing this function. This is a function, right? Even alert is a function, right? This is your custom function, and in this I'm passing two values, 2, 5, and let me close this, close it with a semicolon, and then now I can say sum of, or you can say add 2 plus 5, right? Alright, so let's look at this example. Functions, okay, 7. What happening here is not much about when you click alert is happening. It's more about how to write a function, how to pass a parameter, how to return a value. So we have seen 3 things here. Define function, pass parameter, and return a value. Okay, these are the 3 things we have seen in terms of functions, right? And you can choose to have any name that you want, and when you call them you can use the same name, pass the parameter with a comma separator, and whatever value that is in first value will go sit in the first variable. All right, let's create another function. Okay, it's called as anonymous function, where you don't have a function name, and whatever is the output of that function, we are storing that in the variable of size. Okay, and here we don't give any name to a function, right? We just say function, and we say width and the height, and we return width multiplied by height, right? Remember this, there is no name, so it's an anonymous function, but we are doing some kind of operation inside the function. Okay, how do you call this function? You can say size, right? This size This is the name of the function now, and you pass like 10 comma 20, and you can say area 10 into 20. Right, you are using size, that is the variable name, and then you are basically passing the parameter. This parameter will go sit here and this code will be executed. This is called as anonymous function. Okay, area 10, 20, 200. Okay, you want to look it nicer, add a break here, right? 10 and 20, 2 plus 5. All right, very simple to understand. Functions are very simple to write. You define it with a function name, and then you pass the parameters, you return the value, and you can also define the anonymous function. All right, so that's all about function. I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the lecture on objects. So let's understand how to work with objects. So we're going to copy paste the same boilerplate here, call it object, right? So let's define a method and accept some value from the user. Well, we'll understand how to work with objects in JavaScript. It's a combination of function and objects, so we're going to look into that. So let's define a function called area a comma b. Okay, so let's store this value in the variables of this function. You can use a keyword called this. Using this, you can define a variable and then you can assign that value to this variable. Okay, this variable only belongs to this function. Okay, so it's like a property of a class, right? And now you can define methods in it. So let's define a method. Again, you can say this dot get area. Okay, and we define an anonymous function here, and we can just say return. Now because you have stored it in this object, right, this object, you can access it within the same function, right? This basically looks like a class, right? You are writing a class kind of thing wherein you have your member variables, that is the properties, and then you have your methods in it, and all this is accessed via the this, right? When you say this, basically it's stored as an ob. All right, so let's accept two parameter from user, and then we'll try to create an instance of this function which is nothing but an object, and then we'll try to access these variables. Okay, so for that we'll say var input 1 is equal to, we'll say prompt, enter first value, enter second value, and result is equal to 0. Then input 1 is equal to parse int input 1, input 2 is equal to parse it input 2, right? Then we're gonna say a1 is equal to, now you can create an instance of this area, right? It has a function a comma b, that's nothing but this one, right? You can create an instance of this. Now you can pass your inputs 1 and input 2. All right, then you can capture the result by calling the method of it. Okay, a1 dot, you get area, right? Then you can say console dot log result, right? It's very important to understand this concept of objects, working with objects in JavaScript. You have defined a function and you have created some of the properties, right? This is how you create a property inside a function, and then you have created a function which is nothing but the methods in a function, and typically this looks like a class. Instead of calling this as an function, this looks like a class, right? And then you have accepting two values, then you are passing it as an integer, and then you are really creating an instance of an area, and then you are calling that method of that area, and then you are basically getting the value of the result, right? This is basically like a constructor. When you pass the value to the constructor, it basically accepts and store in this property, and then with the instance of it, you basically call its method. All right, so let's execute this program. The first value is 10, second value is 20, and you can go to console log, and the area is 200. All right, so it's very simple to work with objects in JavaScript, and this is how you basically do it. All right, so that's all about objects in JavaScript, and see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the lecture on events. Okay, let's create a folder. We'll create a file called events. Right, so there are many events, that is you can use it on the web page. Okay, let's do a simple example of click and a mouse over. So the property is called as on click. That is an event, that is also an attribute of the tag. So on click, you want to alert. All right, so you can say click me, and you can add a semicolon here. Similarly, on click also there's one more event called as on mouse over. Right, you can still say welcome to JavaScript, and instead of click me you can say mouse over. Right, let's see this. So if you click this, right, mouse over not working, but when you click it will come. But here when you mouse over, the alert will come. Right, so understand this, how these events work. Okay, so when you write a function, let's say you write a function here. Right, you have defined a function, and the way to call a function from the click event, you have to basically call it from the events only. Okay, you cannot really call a function. You can call a function from here. Let's say you can say sum 10, 20. That's how you basically call a function. You can say alert. But if you want to call that method from some action, right, some action on the page, that's where basically you go with the events. So you basically capture what events is happening on the page, on which tag, and based on that tag event has been triggered, you call that respective function. Okay, a very good example is this. Okay, the value will be 10, 20, 10 plus 20. Okay, so let's run this last time. So that's 30. All right, so this is a very classic example of how to work with events, right? How to work with events, how to call a method when an event has been triggered. Okay, so that's all about events, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the lecture on debugging your code. So we have seen some part of debugging in the first section as well. I also want to reiterate how to do this debugging portion so that you are very clear about this. Let's do a quick example of debug. All right, so let's open the debug code. So what we're going to do is we're going to add the script tag, and we're going to say type JavaScript src 1.js. right, we have seen this example previously as well, and if you go to inspect console, you'll see an error. And how to know where is the error? You click on this file, right, 1.js, and you can see there's no preview. When there is, this file is not found, that's basically it's unable to fill the resource. So you can even try this out. Okay, you can even try this on the body as well. So let's create a href. So on click, you want to call a method, but that function is not available here. Okay, so let's see what happens. And you can see the first thing, the file unable to found. So when you click, there's an error. Okay, and if you see the click, okay, it's a reference error, means this function is not been defined. Okay, and is happening from an event called as click. So you have to read this as how it is been shown here, right? You can see that on click is basically event that is causing this issue, right? And it is saying this sum is not been defined, and also it is showing the number 11, that's basically your line number 11. And when you click on it, it will take you to that file and it will show you where is the error. And not only it is showing error on the 11th, it's also showing on the 6th one. Okay, so if you're on the console, you can go to source, you can open up your page. When you open up the page, it will actually show you what happened on this page as well, right? It's very easy way to find out where is your error with the browser itself. Okay, so make sure you understand this. We have done this for the second time, so to make sure you understand how to debug the code, because this is where you will be spending most of the time, where fixing the issues, or trying to understand some code that is not working. You can actually use this debugging feature available in the browser to debug your code. And make sure when you launch your program to live production site, make sure you have no zero errors. And then the best way to do is load your page in different browsers and see whether you have any JavaScript errors or not. Alright, so this is the best way to debug your program and understand how to solve your issues when you're working with JavaScript. Alright, so that's all about debugging your program. I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the lecture on try catch error. So let's create a folder for try catch. So we'll copy over this file. Alright, so let's open this up. So try catch block is basically a block to catch your errors. So if you have errors, you can catch them in the program itself and not display that error onto the output, but you can catch that error and display a different output, right? You can choose whatever you want to show onto the output. So you write your script tag. Okay, the syntax for try catch is try catch and some variable, right? And then finally you also have a finally block. So finally block executes even when there is an error or no error. This finally blocks will get executed. Anything happens in a try or catch event means if the program is unable to execute anything else, it will definitely execute the finally block. Okay, we'll do an example. Okay, we'll take one example, input 1. We'll prompt the user, enter some number, right? If input 1 is equal to empty, then we'll throw an error. How do you throw? You use a throw keyword and you throw an error. So say no value mentioned, right? You're throwing an error. Okay, and then you can alert input is correct. Okay, if there is no error, then input is correct. In the catch, you can alert the error that you got. In the finally, you can always raise an error to say, okay, I'm executed, have a good day. Okay, all right, So let's say what happens when you don't mention anything, then you should able to catch the error. Irrespective of catching error, not the error, you will see an alert. Okay. So let's enter some value 23. Input is correct. Say okay, have a good day, right? So your finally block is executed, your try block is executed, there's no catch, right? So let's enter okay. So no value mentioned, this is your catch blocked. Have a good day, that's your finally blocked, right? So no value mentioned is basically throwing it, right? This string is thrown with an error value, and then when you catch, that value is in the error, and that value is printed as no value mentioned, right? Let's look at one more time. The catch block, when it's empty, when your value is empty, right, it throws this value, and that value is captured it here, and it's printing that. Then obviously the finally will execute even there's error and there is no error. All right, so that's how the try, catch, and finally blocks work. Okay, when you use it, when you think that there could be an error, and when there's error you want to come out of this try block and want to show some error, you can even do console.log here just to show an error. But you see there is no error in the console log or anywhere, just to say that there is an error and it's not halting it, it's just executing the next point of the code. That's because you're doing a clean exit, and also you're trying to catch this error. You know this error might happen. When you catch the error, you're basically doing a clean exit of your program. Alright, so that's all about try, catch, finally block. It's highly recommend to write your program inside this try, catch block. Alright, so that's all about try, catch, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the lecture on updating the DOM elements. So here we have seen how to access it. Let's see how to update it. Okay, so I'm going to use the same example here, find element, and I will say update. Okay, let's open this up. So this is the update. Okay, so here what we're going to do is we're going to have a paragraph. Okay, and let's have an ID to it, and let's say text value, and we'll close the paragraph. So what we're going to do is when someone is typing in this text box, we'll update the value here, right? And that we're going to do on an event called as on key press. Okay, on a key press we'll call a method called update, and what it will do is it will read the value from here and it will pass the value here. Okay, so all we're going to say is update. So first we have to find that object, right? We have to find by ID. Which ID? The text value ID, right? You're gonna find this, and then we're gonna get the access to our text box value name. That's all we have to do. What we are doing is we are trying to find the reference for this and this, assign this value to this. Okay, and that's done by inner HTML. Inner HTML is nothing but this one. Okay, and you can see the pure magic here. We are not doing anything because the on key press event, right? On key press event is calling this update. So if you're not pressing anything, no event has been triggered. But when you start typing this, right, on the key event, the paragraph data, inner HTML data is being updated. Okay, you can even inspect that. So if you look at this one, and you can see, you see it here, it's automatically updated. That's the power of JavaScript. The main purpose of JavaScript is to update the DOM elements. And if you see, whatever you're typing here is not actually in the p tag, it's actually in the text box, but because of your JavaScript, those values has been copied in the inner HTML. That's nothing but this, and then you're getting the value from the value. Well, that's an example of how to update an element using inner HTML, and I'll see you in the next one. and welcome to the lecture on accessing form elements. So let's create a folder for it. Okay, I'm going to place a file here. Let's review that file. Okay, it's a simple form. Okay, let's review what is the form is all it's doing here. The form has a name, it has an ID, right? Remember, the form has an ID, and then action is nothing, so we are not going anywhere. Then you have your input type, name, and it has an ID. Remember, ID are basically like in variables, right? If you want to give a variable name to any of your form fields, define it as an ID. Okay, remember, var is basically used to define a variable. Similarly, if you want to define a variable for your text box or your form, or you want to refer that, you create a variable, and then that is done by called as ID. So when you say ID, it has a variable name, and that name is your ID name, right? So I'm giving some IDs here. So now I can basically get hold of that variable, right? Get hold of that element. So how it do it? You basically define an ID for it. Then we have a button called submit. Then we call that function, right? So we have defined a function. So whenever someone enter and then click on submit, this method will be called first. Okay, and what is inside this method? Very simple. You basically get element by the tag name. You can have tag name is nothing but this name, right? This is a tag name. You can iterate all the text boxes, and basically you are getting an array here, and inside this array you are trying to access an attribute called type. Okay, so when you say input type is text, you want to extract that value. You can do that, or you can directly say get element by ID and get this text name. Alright, so there are two ways to do it. So first is you iterate in the DROM element. You say get elements by tag name input, you get an array, then you do an iteration, you do a for loop, and with each for loop you're trying to see whether that type is text. Okay, this type is text. Then you're trying to get its attribute name and then the value name, and then you print the message, right? So let's check that. So you have your name and the email. So you say name, email, submit. You can see name and email. Name is basically the attribute name. That's an attribute, and the value. You can even do this way. You can even do this way. Alert document.write. You can even do this way. Alert document.get element by ID. Okay, you can say text name, then you can say text email. Okay, you're simple and straightforward. So let's execute this one, right? You write name and email, right? Name and email, that's your first alert. Then you have your, okay, so we have to say input element we got. We never said value, so we say dot value and dot value, right? So let's refresh that page again. Say name, email, submit. You got the name, you got the email. All right, so it's very simple. There's no fancy things going on here. It's just that using the document, you're trying to access that field, and only thing that you have to remember, the magic happens with this ID, right? You are giving a variable name to it and assigning a unique name to it, and using that document.get element by ID, you're trying to find that value, find that element, and finding that attribute or value or whatever on that specific attribute, right? And here what I'm trying to show you here is you're doing a query of all the elements of tag name as input. Okay, you can even do h1, p, anything you want. Okay, whatever you pass it, like h1 you pass, you get all the tag name of h1, and then you can get the value of that. You can iterate anything you want on the HTML page via the document. So document is your HTML document. It has all the elements, and once you have that array, right, you're trying to iterate and see whether it's type text. If it's type text, you're just printing that value. Okay, you can even do via this directly by accessing that specific ID. Okay, so that's how you basically do a form validation. You basically can get this value and then you can check whether this value is this or this, or is basically right or wrong. All right, so that's all about accessing the form elements by the JavaScript, and I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to the lecture on things to remember. Let's do a quick summary of what we have learned in this section. So we looked at functions. Functions are nothing but a block of statements that perform an action. You give a name to it, then you decide when to call it. Then you can pass parameter to function and you can return a value using the keyword called as return. Then we have looked at object groups, variables and functions together. We have looked at how variable in objects are called as properties and function in objects are called as methods. Portal is an object, then number of room is a property, and check availability is a function. That's how you basically differentiate between a property and a method. Okay, events are action that user performs on the browser. So we have seen some of the events that is performed on the browser, and we try to invoke our own methods based on those events as well. Right, function that handle events are called as event handlers. So these are things that we have seen in this section, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the summary section for intermediate JavaScript. So by now you should be able to learn how to write functions, how to deal with objects, how to create events, write trace logs. You should know some of the common errors with JavaScript. You should know how to write a try-catch block. This is very important. You should understand how to write a clean code with JavaScript. Then working with DOM, how to access those elements, how to change and access those field values, and how to access the form elements. So these are the things that we have covered in this section. I believe you understand all these concepts in the JavaScript. Alright, so that's all for this lecture in this section of intermediate JavaScript, and I'll see you in the next one.